Hi, and welcome to this session about Office 365 Identities and Federation. My name is Michael, and I'm an Exchange Server MVP from Belgium. So the first thing that you might be wondering is, why is an Exchange Server MVP giving a session about identity options and then federation in Office 365? And the foremost reason is that when you're doing migrations to Office 365, if you're doing hybrid deployments, you'll soon enough get into contact with the different identity options. You'll get into contact with ADFS, because when you're going hybrid, in 99 out of 100 cases, you'll be going with ADFS to deploy single sign-on, or as we will see, I'd rather call it same sign-on. So for our agenda of today, we have the different identity options in Office 365, where I will walk you through the different scenarios, the options that you have, ranging from small-scale deployments to really large enterprise deployments. After which, I'm going to talk about DirSync. I'll do a little deep dive into the DirSync functional part, so how it works, what you can do with it, and how you can do some troubleshooting. Because once you're really running into issues, you'll see lots of funky stuff happening, and it's always nice to know where you could start looking in DirSync itself. And then to end with, we'll talk about ADFS, a little short introduction, what you can do with it, talk about the supported topologies, where I see there are a lot of questions about, and then stop over at the different ADFS workflows, or better said, authentication flows, how ADFS works in different scenarios, using Outlook or using Link or using SharePoint Online, Outlook web app. They all have a different way of interacting with ADFS, and it's very important if you're going to support, maintain, or even set up such an environment, is that you know what to look out for in such cases. And then afterwards, you can also post your questions in the same on the same page, and they'll get back to me and I'll answer them as soon as possible. So for today, I hope that you will learn what the different identity types are, how DirSync works, how to troubleshoot it, how the ADFS deployment scenarios look like, how you can recognize the ADFS workflows or authentication flows, and what the major steps are into deploying ADFS. So as said, the different identity options consist of three main areas, or three main options that you have. And first option that there is the Microsoft Online IDs, meaning that you'll store your identity fully in the cloud. There is no relationship with an on-premises environment, and usually this is great for smaller organizations, because they don't necessarily need to maintain an infrastructure on premises. That's also its biggest advantage. On the other side, if you do have at that time an infrastructure on premises, meaning that you have some sort of Active Directory, or it is perhaps an Active Directory, then you'll notice that there are some drawbacks as well. First of all, there is no single sign-on. Users will have two sets of credentials. They'll have their credentials to log into their computers, and they'll also use credentials to log into Office 365, but those credentials are fully different from each other. You can't have two-factor authentication, so there's no way to have a token whatsoever to log into Office 365, at least not at the moment. Perhaps that in future Office 365 will also support two-factor authentication, like Microsoft just recently integrated in Outlook.com. Who knows? But for now, there's no two-factor authentication out of the box. And if you're going to create your users on premises, then you'll have to recreate them manually in Office 365. So this means that there are two locations where you need to keep and maintain and create users. Which is a administrative burden, a lot of extra work that you need to do. And once your organization is growing, and even with a large, with a small number, let's say 25 users, you need to do that management of those users twice. Changing a name, it has to be done twice. Adding a user or removing a user, enabling or disabling a user has to be done twice. So there's a lot of overhead. And especially in those situations, we move over to the second scenario where you keep using these online IDs, meaning that you'll still have two separate identities with their separate set of credentials, but you're going to use DirSync to synchronize the object attributes from your on-premises Active Directory into Office 365. So what does that mean is that objects that you create or modify in your on-premises Active Directory will get automatically transported over into Office 365. So if you create a user, it will automatically be created after a while in Office 365. If you modify a name or you change some attributes on the user account, they will be changed in Office 365 as well. On the downside, there are still no single sign-on, so you keep those two credentials, no two-factor authentication, and DirSync does require a server to be running in your on-premises environment. Sure, you could co-host DirSync with other servers, but you can't set it up on a domain controller because of the SQL database, and the fact that it's actually MIIS running could cause some issues. So unless you're running a file server somewhere on which you can install DirSync, you're actually going to have to deploy a separate server for it. And then if we move over to the third scenario, that's the fully federated scenario, then we're talking about having a single identity. Sort of, actually. We're still going to keep two different object stores. So we've got our on-premises Active Directory, and we've got Active Directory in the cloud, so Windows Azure Active Directory. But the identity provider or the source of authority for the user accounts is no longer Office 365. This means that if a user wants to log in into his services in Office 365, they'll actually be redirected to your on-premises Active Directory Federation server, who is then responsible of handling authentication and giving back a token. So you're effectively moving the authentication from the online environment to your on-premises environment, and as a result you can leverage some additional things like having single sign-on, obviously, because there's only a single set of credentials and it's your on-premises credentials that you'll be using. You'll have a single password policy, the same as you're using on-prem, as it's also your on-prem environment and on-prem identity that you're using. You can integrate two-factor authentication solutions because you can deploy them along with ADFS. And it's also an enabler for coexistence scenarios, not only with Office 365, but also for other solutions. On the down low, however, you need additional infrastructure. You need an ADFS server, preferably two. And if you want to do it securely, then you'll end up, or you might end up with adding two ADFS server proxies. So in general, if we're talking a fully highly available deployment, we're looking at adding 5 servers, 2 ADFS servers, 2 ADFS proxies, and a DirSync server. So if we bring that all together, things look a little bit like this. On the left side, you'll see there is the on-premises environment, whereas on the right side, we've got the Office 365 service infrastructure. And using online directory sync, we're syncing objects from our on-premise environment into the identity platform in Office 365. And the directory store in Office 365 is also connected to the stores used for Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Lync Online, and so on. So once the objects are there, they're known. So as long as we're only using DirSync, then you will see that the IDP, or the identity provider for the online services, remains in Office 365, meaning that they have a password for that user and that it's a separate set of password than the one that you're using on premises. However, when you set up a trust between the identity platform and your on-premises environment, you do that through a federation gateway and a federation server on premises. And from that moment on, you actually move the identity provider role from your from the online environment back to the on-premises environment, which remains the sole authoritative store for all of your user accounts, for all of the authentication against the Office 365 services. So that's a pretty good thing. Now, if we take a look at how this picture works for users, or what the user experience would be like when we're using Active Directory Federation, you'll notice that SSO, single sign-on, gets another meaning. So when we take a look at this table, let's say, for instance, at the farmost left column, we have an Outlook 2010 running on a Windows 7 or Windows 8 machine. Could be an Outlook 2013 as well. And if we're using online IDs, then with each session that we do with Office 365, so every time we open up our Outlook, we have to authenticate. The authentication is based on a basic credential prompt where you enter your username and your password. But luckily, you can save the password, which means that in the background, next time you open up Outlook, it will still be asked for a password, but Outlook will send out these credentials and not ask you for them because you set to save the credentials. Same happens for an Outlook 27 or on older machines like Outlook on a Vista or Windows XP. If we take a look at how Outlook Web Apps works with online IDs, then it's the same thing. You have to log in for each session. So every time you browse to the Outlook web app, you have to enter your credentials. And for ActiveSync, POP or IMAP clients, well, you do that at setup of those clients and they'll keep those credentials. There's a little side note there that when you change your online ID passwords or every, let's say, 90 days, you'll have to re-enter that password in Outlook because Outlook will prompt you for a password again, since the cached credential that's in Outlook isn't valid anymore. And the same happens for Exchange ActiveSync. It won't synchronize until you update the password in the ActiveSync client. Taking a look at the federated IDs, we can actually see that there is a similar experience for the end user. So using Outlook on Windows 7, Windows Vista, XP, or even Windows 8, they'll get a password prompt for each session. The same thing applies, is that you can save the password so that you suppress the password prompt, but if you change your on-premises password at that time, the prompt will come back. This also applies for ActiveSync, where you'll have to enter the password once at setup. Instead of entering an online password, you enter your Active Directory credentials, and when they change, you'll have to do that again in the client. The only difference here is that when you're using a web client, let's say Outlook Web App, or you're using SharePoint Online, then you'll not get a prompt. Well, you might get one depending on how you configured your ADFS, but you shouldn't get a prompt and have true single sign-on. But in general, when we take a look at each of these scenarios, we can actually conclude that there is a better way to say what SSO stands for. It's not really single sign-on. I'd rather call it a same sign-on, because you're using the same on-premises credentials to log in into Office 365, but you're not actually doing a single sign-on unless you're doing or using a web client. So this is a nuance that you need to be aware of, because there is a lot of confusion about what an ADFS can do, and especially for Outlook, which is when you're an Exchange guy, the main tool that you're working with, or when you're moving clients up into the cloud, that password prompt is sometimes not expected. And know that it's there, that you can save the password so that you can bypass it, but rather talk about same sign-on, which makes it less confusing if we are talking ADFS. Now, this is a little bit of primer about the different identity options that you have in Office 365. So I suggest that we move on to the next topic, which is DirSync, where I'll give a little overview before diving into a demo and show you what DirSync can do for you. So basically, DirSync is a directory synchronization engine based on Forefront Identity Manager, and it will synchronize at least a subset of your on-premises Active Directory with Windows Azure Active Directory, which is used in Office 365. It isn't an official statement from Microsoft. It's rather my own interpretation, but I think it covers the load pretty well. And as we will see later on, it's indeed a subset of FIM that is being used. It's the directory synchronization engine from FIM that has been tweaked to be used with Office 365. So the question that might pop up is, why should you actually use DirSync besides the fact that you need it for a hybrid deployment, for instance? Well, it also makes that your on-premises environment is your single place for managing identities. So once you set up DirSync, even if you're not going to do federation, you only have to manage users on premises, groups on premises, memberships on premises. So you don't have to do it twice. So once you get into an environment that's large enough, and I'm talking about 30, 40 users, it might be worth looking into deploying DirSync, because it might be a real time saver. On top of that, DirSync is a relative easy to install tool. It's a sort of set and forget tool. So there's no real reason to hold back for deploying it. On the other hand, the ones a little bit smart might think, well, okay, I'm moving to Office 365 and I've got about 5,000 users that I need to provision. What keeps me from using DirSync and enabling DirSync, moving those 5,000 users into Office 365 and then disabling DirSync again? And I can say to you that it would work. If you want to do that, it would probably work on the down low. It's not supported by Microsoft, so you shouldn't be using DirSync as a easy or one-way or quick provisioning tool. There are other tools for that, mainly PowerShell scripted. But even though it would work, you shouldn't be doing it, because there are all sorts of things that you need to take into account. So just take it with you. That's also the reason why I did put it on the slide, but strike it through so that you would remember very well. Taking a look at how DirSync works, it might seem a bit confusing at first, or it might seem very easy at first, because you see, well, it synchronizes stuff from my on-premises to the Office 365. But when we dive a little bit deeper, we can see that there's a little bit more to it. In a first instance, at the left side, we have our on-premises Active Directory, and at the far right side, we have Active Directory in Office 365. In the middle, there is a little bit enlarged DirSync instance with both of the management agents that are running within DirSync. So there is a management agent, the source AD management agent, which is responsible for getting data from the on-premises environment into a temporary database, which is called the metaverse. And then there is the target web service, which is responsible for getting the data from the metaverse into Office 365. Yes, there are some other nuances. There are some little things that are different than the way I present them here. But in general, this is how it works. And it's very important that you understand this, because once you're going into troubleshooting DirSync or some of the synchronization errors, you will be required to have a look at some of the management agents. And then it's very important to know which ones that you will need to take a look at. So what happens in a first stage of a directory synchronization is that objects and attributes from your on-premises environment are being read by the source AD management agents, and they go through a filter before they hit the metaverse. So this effectively means that not all items from your on-premises Active Directory will end up in the metaverse, and as a result, not all objects from Active Directory will end up in Office 365. And we'll get deeper into that in just a moment. And then once the items have been synchronized to the temporary database, the metaverse, as you will, then the target web service will kick in and we'll start reading those objects, pass them through another filter, and move them to Office 365. In some scenarios, especially in the scenario where there is hybrid coexistence, there's a movement back where there are some attributes read from Office 365 and written back into your on-premises Active Directory, but more on that in just a moment. So when we take a look at DirSync, there are some things that we definitely need to take a look at. First of all, there is the Active Directory health, by which I not only mean that it has to be healthy in terms of replication, but generally your items, your user accounts, your groups, everything that will be synced to Office 365 must be in a good, healthy state. There shouldn't be any attributes that have illegal characters, because DirSync will complain about them. So the first step into deploying DirSync should always be use the deployment readiness tool, which will do an assessment of your Active Directory environment and report or generate a report that tells you, well, these and these objects, they will cause problems. Go and fix them first before actually trying to do a directory synchronization. In some situations, you might find that the readiness tool will give a significant output of items to change, to modify, or to make better so that DirSync can actually do something with them. And instead of going through them one by one, Microsoft recently released a tool which is called ADFS. It's a small tool which uses the same logic as the readiness tool and will generate an output of all the objects that are eligible to be synchronized to Office 365, but that do contain possible errors. And from that one screen, you will be able to modify them all at once, sort of as a batch processing tool, which greatly simplifies the making sure that the objects in your on-premises AD are ready for DirSync. So these are definitely two tools that you should keep in mind and should use. Now, from a topology point of view, less is more. So from a keep it simple point of view, a single forest, single domain is the best thing that you could have. Do you have a single forest and multiple domains, then you'll have not a problem because DirSync can easily run in a single forest deployment. However, if you have multiple forests, then you'll have to go and get some help. This only happens in larger environments, and I'm talking multinationals, but it doesn't mean that you couldn't have it or see it in some smaller areas or smaller industries as well. So once you run into the multiple forest scenario, the first recommendation would probably be try consolidating into a single forest. But if that isn't possible for whatever reason, mainly because it's a huge project probably, then go talk to Microsoft, because in that case they might be able to help you get multiple forests synchronized with Office 365. And then there's the security part. Unfortunately, we run into the security officers all the time. And this time, if you have got a strict delegation of control, know that DirSync requires to be installed an account with forest or enterprise admin credentials. So they need to be enterprise admin at forest level, of course, because else DirSync will not be installed properly. That's mainly because during the installation of DirSync, some permissions will be written into the forest and the different domains, and they will be propagated from there. So if you don't have those permissions, they won't get properly propagated to the different objects, and DirSync will have issues reading objects or writing to objects, which is not a situation where you would want to end up in. On the other side, it's a good thing, you know, all the world moved to 64-bit a while ago, but I think it was somewhere halfway last year, Microsoft also removed the ability to download the 32-bit DirSync engine, so just keep that in mind that you need to deploy it on a 64-bit server. Activating and deactivating DirSync is another thing that you need to take an eye to watch out for, because once you activate it, although it seems to be going quite quickly, it can take up until 24 hours. So if you're a consultant and you go into a customer and you want to deploy ADFS or DirSync or whatever, then make sure that you enable the tenant for directory synchronization ahead of time, or you might end up losing time the day itself. Then DirSync by default will pretty much synchronize your entire Active Directory. And with entire Active Directory, I mean almost all objects except for the ones that are specified in the different exceptions or that are being filtered out. In some cases, you just might want to synchronize a single organizational unit, a single domain, or just a few OUs. In that case, it might be interesting to deploy object filtering on DirSync. Recently, Microsoft decided to support that, and there are three ways to do filtering: either on object attributes, meaning that you will filter out certain objects based on a common attribute. You filter on a domain partition. So if you've got a single forest and multiple domains, you can just say, okay, well, I don't want to synchronize any objects from that or that domain, but I do want to synchronize objects from domain 3. And you can also apply filtering on an organizational unit level, meaning that you can roll out organizational units that you don't want to be synced to Office 365. So all in all, a very good and easy feature. And then last but not least, what you should think about at least is whether you're going to deploy DirSync on a full SQL server or a SQL Express server. Usually SQL Express is good for small to medium-sized deployments. But once you go for the larger deployments, let's say more than 50,000 objects to be synchronized with Office 365, the SQL Express database might be too small to keep all the data and to keep a history of all the different synchronization attempts for the past few weeks, which is necessary for troubleshooting if you want to keep them. And in such case, it's a good idea to move to a full SQL server in the back, which requires some more effort during setup, but all in all, relatively doable. So, as I said earlier, pretty much anything is synced from Office 360 from your on-premises environment to Office 365 in terms of objects, user accounts, but not all objects are synced. No, a password will never be synced from on-premises AD to Office 365. So it's not a password synchronization feature, because if it would be, then you'd have single sign-on without ADFS. Not really single sign-on, you'd have the same sign-on without ADFS. But in this case, it only takes a certain subset of attributes. And if you follow the link on screen, then you'll get to a quick overview of all the attributes. On the other side, I said it earlier as well, there are some attributes that are being synced from Office 365 back to Active Directory. And this happens when you go into the hybrid deployment. So during the setup of DirSync, and that's what we'll see in just a minute, you have the ability to check the fact that it's a hybrid deployment. Well, if you do that, then automatically the setup for DirSync will add some permissions in your on-premises environment to the attributes that you see on screen. It will actually allow the DirSync account to write these attributes on all the objects. And some of them are required for being able to onboard or offboard mailboxes, so to or from Office 365. And the other ones, like for instance the MS Exchange archive status, allows or enables to move or have archives cross premises. So a good example for that is having an Exchange Online archive. This means that you'll have an on-premises mailbox, but have the archive in Office 365. And then by writing back the MS Exchange archive status from Office 365 to the on-premises environment, your on-premises environment is aware of the fact that there is an archive for that user. So let's dive into the DirSync demo, and let me fire up my DirSync machine. So let me quickly close this window. Here we are. This is our server, server 2012, 64-bit of course, running DirSync. Prior to this session, I installed DirSync, which is pretty much a next finish install. The only thing that you need to customize during the installation of DirSync is the installation path, but I chose to keep it at the default location. After installing DirSync, you'll see that there is a new link available which states DirSync configuration. So if you open that link, the new directory synchronization configuration wizard will start. So let's quickly move through it so that you can see how easy it is to configure DirSync. The first page, you just click Next. It's a general idea of what you'll be doing, and then you have to enter your credentials of your cloud administrator. So this has to be a tenant administrator in Office 365. So I'll enter my credentials for just a second, and if those credentials are validated and if DirSync is configured, I'll move on to the next screen where I'll be asked to enter my credentials for my on-premises user. So I'll enter the credentials for an on-premises administrator, and it has to be an enterprise admin just because it needs to be able to write permissions into our on-premises environment. I click Next again, and then I have the ability to enable or not to enable the Exchange hybrid deployment. In this case, I'll choose to deploy Exchange in a hybrid deployment afterwards, so I need the specific DirSync permissions. That's why I need to check it in here. Once I click Next, I can click Finish as well, and it will start configuring DirSync and my on-premises environment. Just for the sake of time, I already ran this wizard before, so you'll have to believe me that it works. And what you will see, and I'll now quickly move to my domain controller, is that on my domain controller, on my domain, you will see that there is a new account that has been given permissions, and that account is called MSOL ADSync account. That account is giving appropriate permissions in my on-premises environment to read several objects and to replicate changes across this domain. In this scenario, it's a pretty simple environment. It's a single forest, single domain environment, but still it's the same principle that applies if you've got multiple domains. So if we take a look at one of the user objects, you'll see that these permissions have automatically propagated to all of these users. So there is the MSOL rich coexistence user account used for a rich coexistence, which has been granted appropriate permissions. So if we take a look at the effective access that a user has, and let's take the rich coexistence account, you will see that that account has been granted no other permission than to write specific attributes. There we are, for instance, the MS Exchange archive status. So you might be wondering, okay, well, the rich coexistence Active Directory synchronization account doesn't have the ability to read or write any other objects. Well, this is true because the MSOL rich coexistence and the MSOL directory sync user accounts, both of them, they work together. So if I would take the effective access of the other one, so let's take the MSOL ADSync account, then you will see that that account has been given read permissions on all the different objects. As you can see, read exchange information, read personal information, and so on and so on. Now, how does that work? Well, during the installation of DirSync, these permissions get applied to the domain level, and from there they're propagated. This also means that if one of your organizational units doesn't have this checkbox, the inheritance checkbox enabled, meaning that it'll block inheritance from a higher OU, the DirSync permissions won't get to the objects. So if you have disabled inheritance anywhere, there are two options to make DirSync work. Either you re-enable inheritance, or you apply the permissions yourself. In the slide deck, you'll find two links to KB articles that define attribute per attribute what permissions each of the accounts needs. If you can't disable or can't re-enable inheritance, you're looking at a huge amount of work, but still there is a way to make it work manually. The easiest way, of course, is just to have inheritance across all your organizational units that you want to synchronize to Office 365. So how do you manage DirSync? Well, if you go and take a look at your C drive, or at least where you installed DirSync, you'll see that in the DirSync folder, and let me quickly move to my DirSync server, that'll be better. You'll see that in the DirSync server, there is a folder called SyncBus. And in that folder is another folder, synchronization service, and there's UI shell. And hidden in all those folders, there is the MIIS client. So Forefront Identity Manager client. And this is immediately where you see the magic happens. So let's start with the configuration about the management agents. So as I said earlier, there are two management agents, the Source AD management agent and the Target Web Service management agent, which each fulfill their part in the entire directory synchronization process. If you would want to make a change to the configuration, let's say that you want to make a configuration change for filtering, then you're going to filter what you're going to read from your on-premises Active Directory environment, and you need to make that modification on the Source AD management agent. So from there, you can open the properties, and there's a possibility to configure the directory partitions that if you would have multiple domains within the forest, you could simply check or uncheck the domains here. If you want to select the organizational units that you want to configure, then you would have to click the containers button here, enter your credentials from your administrator, which I'm going to show now, and then simply check or uncheck the organizational units that you want to sync or don't want to sync to Office 365. The third option for configuring filtering is actually going into connector filtering and then add filters, for instance, for the user account. So as you can see, there are some default filters that will automatically rule out any user account which matches any of these rules here. So if I would want to rule out a user account with a specific name, I could go in here and add a condition that says, well, if the SAM account name matches this one, for instance, then please don't synchronize this this account. Could be useful for service accounts, especially if you have service accounts that start like this. Then you could say that, well, for every user account where the SAM account name starts with svc_, just don't synchronize them. It's not a big deal to synchronize user accounts to Office 365 because they don't use a license. They're not allowed to log into Office 365 unless you actually grant them the permissions to. So it's not that they could do any harm in Office 365, but I can understand that if you have multiple accounts or several thousand, lowering the amount of accounts that you want to sync to Office 365 might keep things a bit neat and might allow you to keep an oversight of what's synced and what's not. So okay, once you've done that, you confirm, you click OK, and you're good to go. Now, from an operations point of view, this tab is actually the one that you'll be living in when doing some troubleshooting in DirSync. So the DirSync process happens in a few steps. The first step is actually, or the very, very first time that you run DirSync, it will do a full import, meaning that it will do a full import into the metaverse of your on-premises environment. And what you can see here is that there are a total of 304 objects that are read from Active Directory. And by clicking them, you can go through the list of all the objects that are being read. In the end, from those objects, only 133 and that are these ones, are the ones that are being written into the metaverse. So as you can see, there are a lot of items that were in the ads here that aren't being written into the metaverse. This is mainly because of some of the filters that have been configured. Now, to know which objects are filtered because a filter was applied, because you filtered them because of an attribute, for instance, you could go to the filter disconnectors and open them from there. So what you can see here is a list of all the objects that are not being synchronized to Office 365 because they have been filtered out. To know why they have been filtered out, and this is especially handy if you're working with multiple persons in DirSync, because someone could have configured something without you knowing it, and you might be required to troubleshoot it afterwards. So you could go into this list and then open up the user account that doesn't get synchronized. For instance, in this case, let's take the guest account, double click it, and then do a preview of that user account. A preview of the full synchronization. So you generate a preview. And then you can go to the connector filter at your left-hand side, where you can see that there is a match for a attribute that is called the isCriticalSystem object, and that because there is a filter defined for that attribute, it didn't get synchronized to Office 365. The same applies for any other account that you see here. So let's try to find one here. For instance, the MISOL ADSync account. It didn't get synchronized into Office 365. Well, if you want to know why, well, because there is a match, it got filtered because there is a match for the SAM account name. And yes, indeed, DirSync by default does not sync the two accounts or the account that is being used to synchronize the Active Directory environment with the metaverse. So it's being rolled out here. So this is how a first runtime of DirSync looks like. Subsequent runtimes, what you will see, for instance, is that when you try updating something, for instance, here we are, I updated a user account, then you can click on updates and you can see the user account that we're talking about, and again you can generate a preview of a delta synchronization and actually try and find out what changed about this user accounts. So you can actually go and match the different old values against the new values here. Now, in some cases, once you're happily running directory synchronization, you might see that you'll get an email that somehow looks like this. So I took an example, and what you can see here is that this is an email that you'll get once there is a DirSync error. So if you don't have an email like this, DirSync is running happily. If you get an error like this, it means, oh, something's wrong. Go and have a look. And in this case, I generalized it a little bit, but you can see that there is an object which will have a name, and in some cases the name might ring a bell, in some cases it might not. With an error description, okay, well, we couldn't do this or that. For instance, we couldn't update the proxy addresses attribute for whatever reason. Perhaps there was a illegal character, a domain that wasn't supported, and so on and so on. And you'll get an on-premises Active Directory object ID. Well, this one is the one that interests us the most. This is the one that you'll be using to find the object in your on-premises Active Directory. So what you'll have to do then is use this on-premises object ID, or how it's also called, the source anchor. And then you go into DirSync, you go to the metaverse search, and you search for the object. In this case, I don't know whether it's a user account or not. So I'll search for all objects, and I'll search for the objects where the source anchor equals the value that I just copied. And when you do that, you'll immediately see that it finds one item in the metaverse, and from there on you can go into the object, take a look at the attributes. So if the error message from the email stated that the proxy addresses couldn't be updated because of a duplicate entry or because of an illegal character, you could go and have a look at the attributes from the user account and perhaps identify the one that is causing issues, and then go into Active Directory and rectify that problem. So this is how you actually distinct user accounts from each other, because there might be two Donna Lewises in the environment, and you might not be able to know by name whom we're talking about. So it's very important that you know how to find these user accounts based on the error messages that you get through email. The same thing applies if you don't find a user account in Office 365, but you're sure that it should be synchronized, then you could try finding it in the error messages. So from the operation logs, you could try going through any of the previous attempts to find whether it is filtered out. But if you run through it, or if it's already an issue for several days or weeks, it might take a lot of time to go through each of the runs and try looking through a humongous list of filtered items. So what you can do then is go through the joiner at the top right corner, and then search for filtered disconnectors in the source AD management agent. So this will actually go and look for any user group or whatever object there is that is being filtered out from the metaverse because a filter was defined. This usually gives you a more and a quicker overview of why something was filtered out. For instance, here, the administrator, it was filtered out for some reason. And again, using a preview of that object, you can do a full synchronization and then try to find out why it was not synchronized. And again, the admin account wasn't synchronized because it's a critical system object. So as you can see, there is a lot to DirSync to know about, but once you get a hang of where you can find the different things, I'm pretty sure that you'll be able to support it entirely. So let's quickly move back to the slides and talk a little bit about the dangers. So be careful when enabling, disabling, re-enabling DirSync, because that might cause data loss. By which I mean, if you enable DirSync, you're synchronizing from your on-premises environment. But if you disable DirSync afterwards and you start managing objects both on-premises and in the cloud, you might have inconsistencies. And if you decide to re-enable DirSync for whatever reason, because I couldn't imagine why enabling, disabling, and re-enabling it. But if you would do that, then know that any change that you made to the cloud object will be overwritten by what's in the on-premises Active Directory, because on-prem Active Directory is the sole source of authority when you enable DirSync. If you have a large environment, before going in and doing a directory synchronization, open a service request to allow to have more than 50,000 objects in your Active Directory in Office 365. Look out for bad health. As I said earlier, object attributes can heavily influence how DirSync is behaving. And if you have any form of delegation, strict permissions in Active Directory, inheritance blocking, make sure that you know that up front, because you'll get some unexpected results, and DirSync will throw some I can't read this error, can't read this object errors to you, so that you know where it's coming from. So when taking a look at that, how about DirSync without Exchange on premises? Well, the first problem that we have there is that on premises you might be missing the on premises attributes. Well, to overcome that problem, you should extend the AD schema on premises. So it might be that you are running Lotus nodes, you move to Office 365 and you don't have Exchange on premises, but you still want to use DirSync. Well, you can do that, but then you should make sure that all the object attributes that you need to run directory synchronization are available on premises as well. The same thing applies for the management tools that are missing. In such case, you could install the Exchange management tools or use third-party tools like the one that you see mentioned there. It's the one that I came across recently. I haven't tested it fully though, but it looks promising because it allows you to do a lot of management in Office 365 through a GUI. So if you're not used to PowerShell, it might be your lifesaver. So some DirSync takeaways. Make sure that you have enterprise admin credentials so that the accounts and permissions can be created properly. Use the MIIS client, which is pretty hidden in the folder structure of DirSync to do some management in DirSync, to do some troubleshooting. Remember that the source anchor of an object is the object GUID in Office 365, and that identifies the object that we're talking about, because other object attributes like a name could be the same, but don't necessarily mean that it's the same object. And that filtering is supported, but always be careful with what you do, because if you could break your tenant heavily by misconfiguring DirSync filtering. So keep these things in mind. So so far, this is the DirSync story. Let's take a look at how Active Directory Federation Services stands in. First of all, a little primer on Federation, and I'm pretty sure that we all know the challenges there are. We all have Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Gmail, Hotmail, Outlook, eBay, PayPal, whatever. We've got tens and hundreds of identities, each with their own set of credentials. And after a while, that becomes pretty unmanageable or difficult to manage. And the same story repeats itself within the company boundaries. We've got multiple applications, we've got multiple services, each using their own credentials. And after a while, we just stack them up, and then you'll end up with scenarios where users are starting to write down their passwords on a post-it and sticking them to the screen, not to forget them. So to face these challenges, we're looking for something that can actually reduce the amount of identities, or at least management of them, to a single source of authority, meaning that we ultimately only have a single username, password, or authentication mechanism to get into each of these applications. We should be able to leverage our on-premises credentials because it's the most logical thing to do. So if we have an Active Directory that is a identity store, then it's very logical that we want to reuse that store to gain access to other applications. It should be simple, and it should allow IT, in this case, to remain in control, setting password policies and stuff. And that's where ADFS comes in, because it is a possible solution, because it allows to use your on-premises credentials in Office 365, simplifies user management, and it's not ADFS that simplifies the user management, but it's the DirSync component that you're using along with ADFS that allows for easier management because you only have to manage them in one location. ADFS allows using two-factor authentication by integrating, for instance, Secure ID or other two-factor authentication providers with it. And you can secure your ADFS by using the client access policies feature, which was introduced in cumulative update 1 for ADFS, which allow you, for instance, to limit the connections to your ADFS environment to a range of IP addresses. If, although that doesn't make any sense to me, you want to limit access to your ADFS environment to only your internal users, for instance. Now, let's have a look at the many ways in which you can deploy ADFS. There are a number of supported topologies, which I think you might find interesting because they allow for great flexibility into deploying, making it highly available and stuff. So one of the first things that you should be aware of, or that you should keep an eye on, is the fact that ADFS indeed needs to be highly available. So if you choose to federate your domain and use a single sign-on with Office 365, ADFS becomes highly critical. This means that if it isn't available, for instance, your internet connection is down, your ADFS isn't working as it should, there is a problem with your operating system, then you won't be able to log in into your service at all. So this is definitely something that you will want to avoid. So when designing for ADFS and high availability, there are several things that you need to keep in mind, such as your internet connection, the ADFS server itself, perhaps your ADFS proxies, the load balancing devices that you're using. Ideally, they should all be highly available, or you could be using alternative services like a third-party hoster, a cloud service like Windows Azure to make your deployment highly available. So let's have a look at the first topology, which is fully supported, and that is a full on-premises deployment. So this means that your internal users will be using your ADFS servers, of course, internally. And they either do that with a single server, or if you make the deployment highly available, then you just add a load balancer in front of that. Now, this is fine for your internal users, but for your external users, you want to have an additional layer of security, and there you've got multiple solutions as well. One of these solutions is to use the ADFS server proxies, which you should deploy highly available in your perimeter network as well. So meaning that you create a sort called DMZ, use a load balancing device to load balance between the ADFS server proxies and then pass on traffic to the internal ADFS servers. But alternatively, as many of us have already some proxy solution in place, you can use the ones that are already there, F5, Blue Code. Use a TMG if you're still using it, UAG. It's possible, although that some of the products do have limitations, but pretty much all of them are valid solutions to be using with ADFS. Another option is to go hybrid. As I said earlier, you could use a ADFS server in a third-party data center to make sure that it's site resilient in case your on-premises ADFS server goes down. But this third-party provider could as well even be Windows Azure or Amazon Web Services if you like. Basically, how it looks like is that you'll deploy part of your ADFS infrastructure on premises and a part of that ADFS infrastructure in the third-party service in the infrastructure as a service, for instance, and then have a VPN connection between both. And then you can choose either to load balance actively between both, meaning that internal users will either go to an internal ADFS server or to the hosted ADFS server, and the other way around, external users going to the internal load balancer or the one hosted in the cloud, for instance. So it's entirely up to you. If you want to stretch this scenario a little bit, you can have a highly available setup on premises and a highly available setup in the cloud. The only thing that you need to keep in mind here is that if you want to have this and to be it truly available, highly available, then you should actually have an AD domain controller deployed in the cloud as well to make sure that if the VPN connection goes down, the ADFS servers that are being hosted off premises can actually still talk to Active Directory and authenticate your users. This also means that if you want to do that, you'd have to have a domain controller, or at least two domain controllers per domain that you're authenticating for. So there are some things to keep in mind here. And this is quite similar to the last scenario where you'll have a full cloud deployment, meaning that you won't be deploying any ADFS services on premise, but will be hosting everything. So this means again that you'll have at least two ADFS servers in the cloud being load balanced with at least two domain controllers for high availability reasons, because if there is an issue with the domain controller and it's offline, then your ADFS won't work either. And make your internal users either connect over the VPN, or as the external users use the internet to go through a sort like perimeter network where ADFS servers are deployed, and then go through the external ADFS servers, which are actually internal ones. So either you go through the VPN or you go through the internet for your internal users. That's entirely up to you. As I said earlier, the infrastructure as a service provider, that could very well be Windows Azure, and it even seems like a very good alternative to having it deployed on premises. So these are the different topologies, but ADFS is also used differently by different clients, which doesn't make it any easier. I fully agree. It makes it a bit harder to grasp at moments. So the different authentication flows depending on the application and the service that you're using. And there are three distinct authentication flows in Office 365. So the first one is the passive authentication flow, which is used for web applications like SharePoint and Outlook Web App. And then you've got the active federation flow, which is used for rich clients like Outlook. It's not fully rich clients, but like Outlook and thus in Exchange Online. And then you've got the metadata exchange authentication flow, and which is used for true rich clients like Link. And each of them behave similarly, but with a few nuances that you definitely need to be aware of, especially when troubleshooting. It might come in handy that you know where your traffic is heading, so that you know what the next hop is where you need to take a look at. So starting with the passive authentication flow, let's simulate a client trying to log in into his Outlook web app. And so at the left side, we've got an on-premises environment with ADFS, and at the right side, we've got our online services in Office 365. So the first thing that happens is that the client tries connecting to Exchange Online, and it will be asked for credentials. So what it will do, it will ask the credentials and then send the credentials off to the authentication platform in Office 365. That authentication platform will see that the user is actually a federated user and will tell them, well, even though that you are a object that I know, I'm not the one who is responsible for authenticating you, but that ADFS server that is configured in this trust, that's the one that you need to go talk to, and here's the URL that you have to go through. So the user takes with him a URL and then connects to that URL, which is the ADFS server. So it connects to the ADFS server, it authenticates against the ADFS server, which will verify with the domain controller in the back whether the credentials are correct. And if they are found to be correct, the user gets a logon token. That token is then sent to the Office 365 platform, where it is validated, because the Office 365 platform can actually read the token and can see that it has been created by the ADFS server on premises. And as a result, it trusts that token, and it will generate an authentication token, which the user then can use to get access to Outlook Web App. So this all happens within a matter of a few seconds, even less if you've got very performing lines. So this is very, very quick. It's hardly noticeable. But the thing to keep in mind here is that Office 365 at no point in time talked directly to your ADFS server. So it's always the client that talked to ADFS. So in this situation, the client was on premises and talked to the ADFS server through the internal network. But if the client would be externally, it would talk to the ADFS server on the same URL configured on the internet. So it would talk to the ADFS server over the internet. So this means that for web applications, or SharePoint Online and stuff, if you'd wanted to limit access only to internal users, then don't publish ADFS online, and it will only work for your internal users. But again, what's the point in putting everything in the cloud if you only want your users to be able to work on premises? If we take a look at the rich client authentication flow, which is, for instance, Link, then we'll see that we've got a user on a computer, and as soon as the user logs onto the computer, the sign-in assistant will automatically use the user's UPN and try and talk to the authentication platform and say, well, here's a user that logged into the computer. Can I authenticate? The authentication platform will say, okay, yeah, well, that UPN is a federated UPN. You should go and talk to the ADFS server, which the client will automatically do. It will go to the ADFS server, repeat the steps as before, try to authenticate, make sure that the password is okay, and then it will get a logon token. It will take that token, present it again to the online service, get an authentication token back, and then store it on premises. This all happens while the user is logging in into his computer. So by the time he fired up Link, the online service sign-in assistant already got a token that allows the user to log in into Link online. So once the user then opens up his Link, it will get his ask for credentials, but he will be able to present that authentication token that was priorly fetched by the sign-in assistant and get immediately access to Link Online. Again, here the difference is the time frame when the token was requested, and as you can see, the client or the ADFS infrastructure at no time got in touch with Office 365 directly. So it was still the client who did all the talking. He got redirected to the ADFS server, got the token from the ADFS server, went to the online authentication platform, but at no time or no point in time there was a direct connection between Office 365 and your ADFS infrastructure. This does change when we're talking about an active authentication flow, which is the case in, for instance, Exchange and Outlook. So what happens is a user tries logging into his Outlook, makes a connection to Exchange Online, and gets queried for credentials. So user goes back and enters his credentials. These credentials are basic credentials over an SSL tunnel, so they're not clear text over the internet, but they're just basic credentials sent over to Office 365. Sorry. The difference here is that it's not the client who gets redirected, but in this case, the Exchange Online will go and talk to the authentication platform in Azure and says, well, I've got an authentication request from a user, and here are his credentials. Can you authenticate this user? The authentication platform will say, well, it's a federated user, but go and talk to his ADFS server. So at that time, Exchange Online will go talk to the ADFS server and say, well, here are credentials that I got for that user. Are these credentials correct? ADFS will check that with the internal Active Directory deployment, and if everything is well, it'll say, okay, well, yeah, it's true, credentials are okay, the user is who he says that he is, here is a logon token. Exchange Online will then use that logon token to give it to the authentication platform in Office 365, get an authentication token, and allow the user to get into his or her mailbox. So the difference here, and that's also why it's called an active authentication flow, is that there is a direct connection between Exchange Online and the ADFS environment on premises. This is also the reason that if you want to use Outlook, then you'll be obliged to publish ADFS onto the internet and make sure that it's functioning correctly, else your clients will not be able to log in into Exchange Online, at least not using their Outlook client. They will still be able to do that if ADFS is working only internally and they're using Outlook web app. Okay, so how can you get it to work? Generally, there are a few steps to run through, and these steps are very, very high level. First, you add a domain to Office 365. Next, you install and configure the ADFS infrastructure. Of course, following the different best practices, the deployment considerations that we talked about earlier. And once you've done that, you go back into Office 365 and you convert the domain, which is a standard domain, to a federated domain. Now, this could very well be that you skip step one and you immediately do the installation of ADFS and then go into Office 365 and add a federated domain. However, I always like to do it in a two-step approach. First add a domain and a standard domain and then convert it to a federated domain. And then once that's done and you didn't get any error messages, you're free to go to the pub and enjoy a beer, which you probably deserved at the end of the day. So let's have a look at how to deploy ADFS. So I switched to my ADFS server, and prior to the session, I already installed the ADFS 2.0 bits on the computer, but I didn't configure ADFS yet. So what you go and do on the server is you open the ADFS 2.0 management console, and you fire up the Federation Server configuration wizard. So the first thing that it'll ask you is whether you want to create a federation service or add a server to the farm. In this scenario, we'll have a new federation service. And then you can deploy a federation server farm or a standalone federation server. It's my advice to you that you always deploy a federation server farm, because if you deploy a farm, you can easily add a second server, a third server, a fourth server, and so on and so on. However, if you do that, or if you install a standalone server and you decide to add a second server afterwards, then you have to uninstall that server, create a new farm, which is a lot more hassle. So you can start off with a federation server farm with just a single server with no problem. However, against my own advice, I'm going to use a standalone federation server here just to save us some time in the configuration. Next, I'll have to do a configuration of the federation service, and as you can see, it will automatically pick a name based on a certificate that was installed on the server. Well, prior to running the ADFS 2.0, I already imported the ADFS certificate that I'm going to use for my ADFS server. Now, this certificate is a third-party certificate bought at a third-party certification authority, and this one is going to be used for communications only. So this certificate is used to secure the SSL connection to my ADFS server. Anything that has to do with signing or encrypting a certificate is done by self-signed certificate by default, and it's also a recommendation that you don't touch the self-signed certificates that ADFS will deploy itself. So I select the certificate, I click next, and I click next again, and then it takes a while before it installs. So let's just wait a few more seconds until it configures ADFS successfully. Okay, so as you can see, the ADFS server installed successfully, and as you will notice, it also installed using a Windows internal database. I'll talk about that in just a moment, but by default, ADFS will use a Windows internal database and not a SQL server. Okay, so what we did now is have ADFS service installed. As you can see, automatically the certificate that we used or specified during setup is used for services communications, so for the SSL tunnel to the ADFS server. And then we've got a token decrypting and signing certificates, which are two self-signed certificates. They matter also, but don't touch them. Use the self-signed certificates by default. Now, how can we make sure that our ADFS server integrates with Office 365? Well, it's a series of actions that we need to do. And we go into Office 365 into PowerShell, into Windows Azure Active Directory, and we tell that domain, so in this case that will be exchangelab.be, that it's a federated domain. And by running that commandlet, by running that commandlet, we will actually tell Office 365 or provide Office 365 with all the endpoints that it needs to connect to. So first of all, fire up the Windows Azure Active Directory PowerShell module and connect to Microsoft Online Services. So I'll enter my credentials again. There we go, that's my admin. And connect to the online service. So once that's done, and I hope I typed in my password correctly, we'll be connected to the service and we'll be able to make some changes. So it takes a few moments. Okay, there we are. So we're now connected to Office 365. Using the get MSOL domain commandlet, we can see which domains are configured in our tenant. And as you can see, exchangelab.be was previously added and is a verified domain, and it's currently a managed domain, meaning that it's a domain in Office 365 with user accounts and credentials stored in Office 365. Now, if we're running from the ADFS server, there's nothing special that we have to do. However, if you want to run these commandlets from a server that's not the ADFS server, then you have to run the set msol ADFS context commandlet, which will actually bind this connection to the ADFS server, because when converting a domain from a standard domain to a federated domain, we're actually reading the ADFS configuration and uploading it to Office 365. So if you're not going to do or to run these commandlets from the ADFS server, you need to make sure that the computer knows where to get the ADFS information, and you do that using the set msol ADFS context commandlet. However, in this case, we're running from the ADFS server, so there is no need to run this commandlet. Next, we'll convert the domain exchangelab.be to a federated domain. So convert msol domain to federated, and as a domain name, we'll take exchangelab.be. And what we'll add here is also support multiple domain. What does this do is that if I have multiple top-level domains, exchangelab.be, xblock.be, and so on, I can use multiple domain names with the same ADFS infrastructure without having to deploy different ADFS farms or ADFS services. So I enter the credential, and then automatically what happens is that my my ADFS server tries to send the information to Office 365. Now, as you can see here, this has thrown an error, and I deliberately did that so that you can actually see what happens. So at this time, the client is not authorized to access the endpoint to read the information. So as you can see, the command that invoked an action on the computer, which tried to read something from the ADFS server. It was actually trying to read the ADFS information that it needed, but in order to read that information, you need to have admin credentials on that machine. So what I'll do is I'll run the Windows Azure Active Directory module again as an administrator and connect again to the online environment. Okay, there we go. And I'll repeat the exact same steps. So there we are, I am connected. Let me just quickly move that over here, make it a little bit bigger, run get msol domain again. As you can see, I have the same output, and use the same commandlet as I used before. And I'll just wait a few seconds, and I'll normally get the confirmation that exchangelab.be is now successfully updated. If we do the get msol domain commandlet again, you will see that exchangelab.be is now a federated domain, and we've successfully deployed ADFS. If you want to know what information was received by Office 365, then you can run the get msol domain federation settings for the domain that we just configured. So that's exchangelab.be. And then you will automatically see all the endpoints that Office 365 needs to know in order to be able to redirect or your clients or its own services to your ADFS servers. And on top of that, it also contains the key that is being used by the sign-in certificate on your ADFS server, so that your Office 365 Windows Azure Active Directory authentication system can read the tokens that your ADFS server crafted, so that it can verify that those tokens are genuine and that your user is allowed to enter the service. So as you can see, all in all, deploying ADFS is relatively easy. The hardest part is remembering the different commandlets, and especially remembering the different authentication flows. So let's move back to the slides and talk about the deployment tips and caveats, things that you should be looking out for. So first of all, when deploying ADFS, make sure that you use at least ADFS 2.0. So if you're using Windows Server 2008 R2, like I did in my demos, you'll need to download the ADFS 2.0 bits from the download website from Microsoft. However, if you're using Windows Server 2012, which is fully supported, then you can use ADFS 2.1. There are some slight differences in deploying or the components that you have to use, but this is all well documented on TechNet. Mind the certificates, by which I mean that you must make sure that the certificate that you're using for communications, so the one that you're using to secure the SSL channel, must be a third-party certificate from a certification authority like DigiCert or VeriSign or any other one out there. So make sure that you buy the right certificate. A tip from me is that you should always use an ADFS server farm, even if you're only using a single server, especially if you're looking to extend that farm later on. It's the way to go, because a single server setup, which you don't deploy in a farm, can't be extended, which means that you can't add any servers to that. If you want to do that, you'll have to uninstall ADFS, deploy a farm, and add servers to that farm. However, if you do it from the get-go, install a server farm using a single server, then you can easily add servers without any additional work later on. So definitely something to look out for. And then there is the question about which database that you're going to use with ADFS. You can use the Windows internal database, which is the default. But there are some drawbacks with regards to high availability. These drawbacks mainly come from the scalability, because if you want to deploy more than 5 servers in an ADFS server farm, then you'll have to use a SQL server. But this also means that you'll have to back up the SQL server and do some extra deployment steps. Rather difficult things, if you ask me. I like the Windows internal database because an ADFS server scales very well. A single server can handle a lot of clients, so imagine having 3 or 4 servers. It has some sort of built-in high availability, by which I mean that the configuration changes to ADFS are automatically replicated when using the Windows internal database between each ADFS server. And it's only from a disaster recovery point of view that the Windows internal database is a little bit tricky, because the first ADFS server that you deploy becomes the primary ADFS server from where all changes are being replicated to the other members in the farm. If that server were to crash or become otherwise unavailable, the only way to recover the farm from a configuration point of view is to restore the internal database from that server to that primary server. So you'd better make sure that you have a consistent backup of that primary federation server. If it goes down, it's not a big of a deal, because your ADFS farm will continue working as it was before, but you cannot make any configuration changes while it is down. So there is a clear difference between the SQL Server part and the Windows internal database, but I mainly or usually use the Windows internal database because of the ease of use, the ease of deployment, and the relatively limited downsides there are to it. So this brings me to the session takeaways of today. And the first one is very important. So before starting to deploy DirSync, make sure that your Active Directory is in a healthy state. Use the tools that are made available to you, like the readiness tool to check whether you should make some changes in Active Directory. And if there are, use IDFix. It's a new tool, it's an easy tool, it's very convenient to use. And if you do run into issues, the MIIS client executable for DirSync is the place to go to start troubleshooting DirSync. For ADFS, mind that there are 3 authentication flows, the active, passive, and the metadata exchange endpoint, each used for different workloads. So the active one is used for instance, for Outlooks. Passive federation flow is used with web clients, Outlook Web App, SharePoint Online, and the metadata exchange endpoint is used for Link. And then if you're deploying ADFS, make sure that you make it highly available. If not, if it goes down, you won't be able to access your online services. That's not what you want after all, is it? So I would like to thank you for attending this session. If you have any questions, please leave them below. And please do have a look at the other sessions as well. There's some great content over here. And if you enjoyed this presentations or any other one-on-ones, please tweet it, retweet it, share it with your friends, and tell them there's great content here. Thanks for attending, and see you soon. Bye.